I'd love to start off with just this idea of customer centricity as our North Star. And that North Star in business, we're for profit organizations, right? It's got to be leading to revenue growth, long term sustainable growth of the business. Tell us maybe your philosophy of client centricity.
Absolutely. And, Steve, you can ask people that have worked with me and my teams. One of the things I always ask them to do is literally write the phrase, think like a customer, and stick it in front of your device. Because I mean this holistically when I say it should be the North Star, it should be the point with which we begin to think, process, evaluate, etc. There's two things, and you used a very important word, sustainable, a long-term sustainable relationship. So what's sustainable? Sustainable means if you're building a long-term relationship, it means you're solving a problem today, a need, a problem, whatever it is. And we talk about both, it's needs both from a rational perspective and an emotive perspective. We talk about that in a minute. But it's solving an immediate need. It is anticipating a need or a situation or a problem for tomorrow, the short term, and then it's preparing and adapting for a longer term need. And when you balance those three out from the buyer's perspective, from the customer's perspective, and remember, I'm using customer from a B2B buyer perspective, right? But when you start from there, then you're building a sustainable relationship. Even in the sales and marketing realm, Steve, the same holds true. If you think and put yourself in the shoes of the buyer, and then you start working backwards into what it is that you provide, the services, your proposition, etc., will be so much more meaningful. So I kid you not when I say I literally have think like a customer. I remember it. I have it in front of me, even though it's been 20 years that I've used the phrase. I still have it as a reminder.
Well, here's what I'd love to do before we start talking about like how we apply it in our business. I'd love to ask you why we don't regularly do that. Because you and I were talking before we started here about a McKinsey study, right? And it said 63% of B2B leaders, C-suite leaders, they literally recognize that the client is the source of almost every good idea that we have inside of our business. They're the innovation engine, yet only 15% of them really incorporate customer input into what we do. So there's this gap, right? Why is there this gap if it should be our North Star?
Steve, it's a great question. And I think for that, we might have to tap into a little bit of human psychology. Not that I'm a psychologist, but by the way, in our professions as marketing professionals, sales professionals, or even as leaders, we are somewhat psychologists. But I think you'd have to tap into human psychology because it isn't easy. It isn't easy to take criticism. Let me ask you this. How many times have any of us or you sat in a meeting where somebody comes in and says, here's what a client says. And very quickly, somebody around the room, one of the C-suite persons says, you know what, we got to watch what that client says because blah, blah, blah. They begin to justify it. I'm not saying, by the way, that's always wrong, right? Or they go, you know what, this client is too junior, not important. They're not the decision maker, the individual. Or, this client is such a, you know what, they always whining. There's so many times I think human nature, we're not really built to take criticism well. And very often client feedback is critical, not for the purpose of being bad or mean, but it's critical because it's different from what we think. One. Two, sometimes, if you're Steve Jobs, by the way, you believe that the client didn't know, the customer didn't know what they want, and only Steve Jobs knew. But there's few of him. There's very, very, very few of him. The vast majority of people, we tend to trivialize what we hear or justify or overlay our thought process, our mindset. So that's why I use the word think like a customer. If you put their frame of reference, their thought process, you get to a different place. But I think very often we kind of go back into our shells, so our human shells, so to speak, and trivialize, not pay enough attention, overlay our biases. So whilst we all say, like, the Jeff Bezos put the empty chair of the client customer in the room, right? But how often do we look at that chair and go, this is what the customer says, and it's not what the customer says, it might be what I think, or I hope, I want the customer to say, or I use it as a proxy. So I don't mean to say that a lot of folks are disingenuous in trivializing what the client feedback is. But what I am saying is there is a general human bias to do so. So then that means you have to cognitively, very cognitively, and make even larger effort to remove those biases as you're processing that customer feedback.